Hey guys, welcome back to Contest Prep University. Joe Klemczewski here. We're going to do another one-on-one episode in that series. If you remember last week, Adam and I did a podcast on supercompensation. I should put that in air quotes, the myth of supercompensation, and how that traditional methodology that we rail against so often of harsh carb depletion, and then some kind of a supposed magical super compensatory um, level of carbs can then supposedly again give you a 30+% increase in glycogen capacity that you may not have in a normal circumstance. And go back and watch that one if you didn't see it, because I hope we dispelled that with enough accuracy for you to have some buy-in. And I think it's most easily seen if you just test it yourself. When you're lean enough and you do some little mock peaking strategy run-throughs, you'll see that it's just not only impossible for you to create that consistency and predictability that you want, but it doesn't even last. It's once you get beyond that initial fill up and probable spillover, and then you're coming back down from that homeostatically, you're moving from one direction to the other. So now you're probably going to lose some muscle fullness from that quote supercompensation, and you're going to be in transition to a flatter state. And so your skin can look a little softer, saggier, that sort of thing. So all of that is one way not to do it. And we talk a lot about a more linear load or progressive linear load. Today, I want to talk about just being linear, not even really relying on carbs for a lot of fullness. But first, you have to understand how this mechanism works physiologically. So, of course, you're consuming food. A decent amount of that is going to be carbohydrate just by percentage and volume, and your body is going to use glucose as a form of cellular energy. And anything that we can store, your body's going to start storing body fat right away, even in small amounts, even in a calorie deficit. But as that whole cascade of storage process begins, your liver, your muscle tissue, insulin's going to shuttle glucose there, and you're going to store it as glycogen, bundles of glucose. Now, that takes about 4, 6, 8 hours to kind of start that process of synthesis. But it can take fully up to 24 or 48 hours to get you all the way full. And you can't do it with one super big, great, carb meal, because a lot of that will just get stored as fat. Whatever you don't need right now in this instant is going to get stored in all of the places your body can store energy, including body fat. So that massive, rapid approach, for a lot of people, you will literally start gaining a filminess of extra body fat that you're starting to gain. You're not going to gain pounds, but even grams or ounces of body fat newly stored 2 or 3 days before your contest is going to be a problem. You're not going to look your best. So go to the other extreme. And what about those people who are just really carb sensitive? Or maybe their food levels have already come up to a point before the contest, almost to maintenance levels, and they just don't need a lot of increased glycogen storage. They are already full. Well, those are reasons why you may not just want to rely on carbs at all. I'm going to give you two circumstances with contests that I have or competitors I have competing in contests just in the next couple of weeks. One is a female who in our first run through some contests, she said, I just don't do well with carbs at all. And she went back through some of her prep photos, and especially the last couple of weeks when she was really lean, and said, I always look my best when I'm my tightest, which of course is pretty normal for everybody. But she has enough muscle tissue and enough muscle fullness that she just doesn't need that much to look full. And so, with the advantage of having a contest when we could see, okay, here was our strategy, here's what we did. And yes, you were unbelievably super full. No spillover, but you can get extremely full with very little, carbohydrates. So now we've been able to test that leading up to another contest. And our approach is to stay pretty linear. It's just carbs flat across the board during peak week, a pretty normal day for contest morning, and then relying on hydration and minerals to bring her back up. So why would I not want to, quote, get her super, 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 super full? Because she spills over pretty easily. We've seen that. I can even see that in her photos from right out of bed to after a meal or two, and then later in the day. I have another client who's a phenomenal pro athlete, and he's pretty ectomorphic, ecto meso, good amount of muscle, but he can get as lean as humanly possible. And we are at a point, we've competed together in the past where he's at a higher level of food than I have helped him peak with prior. And so as I'm preparing his peak week planning, we looked at some footage, some videos, and some photos of him over the last couple of weeks, an hour and a half, 2 hours after meal one, after meal two, after meal three. He's very conscientious in providing that kind of data. And I said, yeah, it's just clear, like you're getting very full without even having to, quote, carb up. Mainly because protein, carbs, and fat, just calories in general, are higher than usual. Now, he did say, but I'm definitely not as full as I can be, which obviously, point granted, he's still dieting, he's still a week away from his contest. So my goal is going to be in his planning very, very linear with a small amount of progressive thrown into that progressive linear to the point where on contest day, again, we just don't have to rely on a lot of carbs. So what happens in this situation is when I can talk a client into trusting hydration, if you're not over carbed, water cannot spill you over. No matter how many times I have repeated that in 30 years, I know it's very difficult for a lot of people to understand. But if your carbohydrates are at maintenance levels or below, then meal to meal to meal, more water cannot spill you over. If you, it's the carbs, even if you are in the process of dehydrating, what little levels of hydration you have, it is the superfluous amount of carbohydrates, more than you need, more than you can digest, that will spill you over. And you'll also be smaller in the process. So your muscle tissue is now shrinking. You still have the same amount of dermis, the same skin. Now, without that water volume in the muscle, your muscle tissue is just smaller and flatter, and your skin looks worse. So you're losing the kind of fascial separations you get between muscle, the really small fasciculating striations that you have when your muscle tissue, your muscle cells, muscle fibers are literally hydrated. So let's go back to a couple points I want to just wrap up and summarize with, when you would want to use some carbs, how much, and when you just don't, because I also want to talk about other ways that people try to manipulate macro variables, and it's just in error. There are a lot of inconsistencies and ways you could mess that up. So somebody who really has a pretty fast metabolism, and we might still have calories kind of low heading into peak week, that may be a person that needs a pretty good amount of carbs to then not end up being flat on stage. And somebody who needs that volume of food, it is 100% a potential regret that you didn't get enough carbohydrates in early. I'm not talking about a depletion and then super compensation. I'm talking about pretty linear and then progressing enough. It might look like that kind of a level across the board. Your first 3-4 days of peak week are pretty linear. Then you go pretty high for a day or two heading in. Remember, takes 24 to 48 hours to fully assimilate glycogen throughout all of your muscle tissue, but you start that process, every meal, within 3, 4, 5, 8 hours after a meal, you're definitely synthesizing glucose into glycogen. So whether we need to start that on the day before or 2 days before kind of depends on that person, depends on where that level has been. If they've been somewhat low through peak week, we're still trying to squeeze out a little bit more body fat. Then about 48 hours before the contest, that's where we may go not sky high, but as high as we want, and then level off. A lot of people like kind of a day two taper. Arguably, that's not horrible. If you might have caused a little spillover from too much 2 days out, then that can give you a chance to clean that up. But you can also do the opposite. You can go really high, which is great. And then maybe you should have gone just as high or higher, but you thought, well, everybody does this little taper, so I should do that. And then what if you're just not quite filled up with glycogen? Now, again, muscle tissue is starting to deplete, and you could be potentially dealing with a little bit of spillover, maybe not, but at least you have missed the chance to be as full. Those people typically then make the mistake of trying to shove in more carbs on contest day, and you cannot assimilate those carbs. Remember, I said if you're getting more than you can digest and use at that meal in that moment, then you will spill over. And how long it takes you to rectify that is probably longer than you have before you get on stage if you're doing that on contest morning. So you have to realize what you are carrying into contest morning is your glycogen base. That's how much carbohydrate you're going to have. The carbs you eat on contest day are to simply spare what's in your muscle. You don't want your body systemically to have to rely on what's in your muscle tissue. So meal to meal, you're giving your body exactly what it needs to not spill over and not deplete. But you cannot rely on new glycogen synthesis on contest day. That's why the hydration and the minerals matter most. So again, I can't argue this point enough, even though even my own clients will sometimes, find it very hard to trust this, that you need a smorgasbord of hydration before the contest. I know trips to the bathroom and you're backstage and so forth, all of that factors in, but you will regret going to the stage without enough hydration. So what now let's go to that one final extreme. What if somebody just doesn't look good with any carbs? Like I want to keep my carbs pretty low, pretty low, pretty low, go into contest day, never have an increase. Can I peak that way? Are there other ways to bring in enough macronutrients where I get some kind of filling effect? So protein, even even in the midst of carbs being pretty linear and maybe your calorie deficit isn't that great, protein can be converted into glucose. It's not the easiest thing for your body to do, and it takes a little time, but it can. And it basically is like the glycemic index. It's like a low glycemic kind of way of doing that. If I have to rely on protein I'm consuming to be converted into glucose, first of all, that means my carbs were definitely low, and it's not going to necessarily give me the kind of glucose to glycogen synthesis I really need. But if you're just afraid of spillover and you're afraid of carbs, or you think carbs don't really help you fill out that well, it's too hard to control, at least you have, quote, too much protein where some of that is being turned into glucose and slowly glycogen. It's not going to help you pump up, but it's going to help you at least not get as depleted. What a lot of people do is they say, Joe, my old coach would have me fat load. They would have me eat like a jar of peanut butter a day for the 2 days before the contest. That's just asinine ridiculous physiologically, because for you to convert fat into glucose into glycogen is just not going to happen. Your body turns fat into fat. It just does. You don't have those mechanisms where the glucose goes through your liver to be converted into glycogen, liver glycogen, or converted into lipids to then maybe be stored as fat. Fat literally gets stored as fat. Boom. There's just no complex mechanical process. If that's all you're consuming, if you're having zero carbs and high fat, then certainly your body's going to use a portion of that fat as just energy. I mean, just to be used now. You're not getting hardly anything synthesized into glycogen. For people who say that might have worked for them, I don't know if I've seen anybody who could say, here are the photos. Look, I look amazing when I fat load. Um, most people are going to potentially, even if they're dealing with a little bit of fat gain in those couple of days, as I said, I mean, think of a pound of stored body fat being around 3,500 calories. You're probably not over consuming 3,500 to 7,000 calories over those 2 days to where you could store an appreciable amount of body fat. We're just talking about tiny, tiny filminess amounts of body fat. It's almost the equivalent of carb spillover. But what happens is you're getting a shit ton of sodium, because of something like that peanut butter. It's always what people fat load on. I've never heard somebody say I'm fat loading on a bottle of olive oil or eating 12 avocados. It's usually always peanut butter. So it's sodium, 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 which has a really good muscle hydration benefit, but you just then have to deal with that potential amount of fat that wasn't great for you. So again, I don't think that's a contender for, any kind of a strategy, but it does show if you do have some carb sensitivity levels, you just don't like your lack of control and predictability. Maybe you do keep your carbs pretty linear and you use just a small amount of increase in fat because that fat is now carb sparing for the muscle glycogen you have. And again, if you're using something like peanut butter, you're getting more sodium. But I would rather control that in other ways, direct sodium addition to meals so it's more finite and strategic. So real quick summary. When would you not use carbs or much carbohydrate to load for a contest? If your carb levels are already pretty high, you're just at maintenance levels, you've done a really good job of coasting into the contest, throttling up on your food intake, and now approaching contest day, you're just not that much in a calorie deficit. Well, you don't need to carb load if your body's already full of glycogen. So it just makes that so much more consistent and predictable. You're not carb sensitive at that point. Your metabolism is turning glucose over, much, much more efficiently anyway. So that's one reason you would not need a lot of carbohydrate. Another is, you're dieting down pretty steadily. You're still grinding it out, and you just know that too much carbohydrate at the end is going to risk spillover because you are very carb sensitive at that point. Uh, Depending on your body type, if you're really, really, really ectomorphic, I would argue you're probably not having to diet that hard anyway. But if you are and you just need that extra heavy load because you could risk being too flat, then you're that traditional person who would do some form of kind of a backload. But a lot of us just wouldn't. We have more sensitive metabolisms and we're sensitive to spillover. And so we're just going to rely on a little bit, get our glycogen levels up close to full without crossing that spillover line. And then we're going to rely on hydration the next day, minerals. When I say minerals, I mean obviously sodium, potassium, but the other ones, calcium, magnesium. You need kind of a good homeostatic compound. And timing matters. If you have a meal that has 3, 5, 600 milligrams of sodium, just like carbs, after a couple hours, that effect has diminished. And so you need to know when to do that. But the carbohydrates you would be eating, if you've been very linear in carbs all week long, or maybe a slight increase, remember the carbs that you schedule in your meals on contest day are there to support the homeostasis of your internal glycogen stores now. You're not trying to create more glycogen loading on contest day. Not going to happen. You don't need that much glucose going from your GI system, your stomach, small intestine into the bloodstream, into the muscle to even get much of a pump. Again, at that point, the muscle glycogen that is there is going to create that base for you. But you need the hydration to utilize it into muscle fullness to see that actualization. So I'm gonna leave it there. I'm gonna start getting redundant and repeating myself. But if you have any questions, let me know. A lot of people who watch our content end up messaging me through Instagram or right on our YouTube channel. You could also email me directly. You can go to my website, thedietdoc.com, to get that contact form. But also, as I like to remind people, we do have our Contest Prep University D1 Club. So a group of competitors and coaches who, for $3 a month, we're in this private forum, and we chat about these things. A lot of our content here we end up talking about. Spurs a lot of great conversation. We're facilitating it with our staff and peer-to-peer support. So those of you who have coaches, it's fine. Gives you another perspective, another point of view. Those of you who don't have coaches, this could be a way for you to still get some support. I mean, we allow our D1 club members to upload photos and ask everybody questions and all that. So it's just a great place to have, instead of just one coach, a community of people who are feeding into your support a little bit. But consider that. Let me know. It is kind of a Fight Club thing where we don't have just a link you can go to. You have to kind of come to us, and we'll talk you through it and give you the link and all that. But appreciate that. Let me know if you have any questions, and we'll see you next time in Contest Prep University.